Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can use Flask to create a quiz using object-oriented programming and Flask logic. Okay, so I've created a folder in my Visual Studio Code just called Quiz App. I've also CD'd into it in my terminal. First thing we're going to do is just create a virtual environment. So we'll say Python 3-m venv and we'll just call it myenv. And then once that's done, we are just going to activate it. So we'll say source myenv bin activate. And now that we have our virtual environment active, we will say pip3 install Flask. And whilst that's happening, we'll come over to our Visual Studio Code and just sort out the folder structure. So we'll create a templates, and inside that we'll create a quiz.html file. We're going to create a app.py file just so it can run, and then we will have a quiz.py file, and this will hold our classes. So the first thing that we're actually going to do is just import all the Flask things that we need and make sure that the server is set up correctly. So we have everything installed. So we'll come over to here and we'll say from Flask, import Flask, render template, request, redirect, URL for, and session. And then we will just create a new variable called app, set that equal to Flask, and pass in name. And then we'll just say app.secretKey. And this can be anything that we want, so we'll just say test environment. Okay, so now that we have our app, we now need to make sure that it's the main file. So we'll say if name is equal to main, and then we'll say app.run, and we'll just pass in debug equal to true, just in case we come into any errors. And now in here we'll create a root, so we'll say app.root / and we'll say def index, and this will just return return render template quiz.html. And then to make sure that everything's working correctly, we'll just create a hello world. And if we come over to our terminal and we say Python 3 app.py, we now have a development server. So if we paste this into here, we have hello world. So now if we come back to our Visual Studio Code and we head over to our quiz.py file, we need to have two different classes, and both of them will be created within this quiz. We'll have a class for questions, and every time this is initialized, we need to have a text, an option, so the quiz text, the quiz answers, and then the correct answer. So we need to pass in which answer is actually the correct one as well. So we'll say def init, and then we'll pass in self, text, options, and correct option. And then we'll say self.text is equal to text, self.options is equal to options, and self.correct option is equal to correct option. And that is all we actually need for our question. We don't need any methods or anything like that. It's just the text, the options, or the quiz, the question, the answer, and the correct answer. So now we'll create a quiz which will handle basically the app, and we'll say init, pass in self, and then here we'll just create a self.questions, and this will be an empty list. So on the first instance of this loading, we will have a list of empty questions, and this is essentially what's going to be at the very, very beginning of the app. And now we will just create a method called add question, and this is going to append the question to this questions. So we'll say def add question, pass in self and question, and then here we will say self.questions.append and then question. So we are appending this question that's being passed in into this list of questions. And that is actually all of our logic for our quiz.py. So now if we head back over to our app.py, the first thing that we need to do is initialize the quiz and create some questions for it. So we'll say quiz. And now we have a quiz instance, we can actually add some questions into the questions list that is an attribute of the quiz. So we'll say quiz.addQuestion, and then we'll say question, and now we can create whatever questions you want, but we'll say what is the capital of France, and then the answers will say Paris, London, Berlin, and Madrid. And then we obviously need to pass in the index for which one is the correct one, and obviously 0 because it's the first index and indexing starts with 0 on lists, so we will be getting Paris. So next we will say quiz.addQuestion, and we'll create an instance of question again, and we'll say which planet is known as the red planet. And then we will create another list, and we'll say Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then we will pass in the second index, which is number 1, so Mars. And then we'll say quiz.addQuestion, and then another index or another instantiation of the question. And we'll say what is the largest ocean on Earth, and then we'll create another list. We'll say Atlantic, Indian, Arctic, and Pacific, and then we'll pass in the third index or the fourth index, so number 3. And then just to make sure that all of these work when we actually run the app, we need to make sure that we have actually passed in the or imported the correct classes at the top. So we'll say from quiz, import quiz and question. Okay, so now we have our index root. We need to make sure that we set, when we first come to it, we set a score and the current question so we can keep track of it using sessions. So in here we'll say session, and we'll say current question, and we'll set that equal to 0, and then we'll say session and we'll say score, set that equal to 0, and then here we are going to actually remove this and we'll say redirect, and then here we'll say URL for and quiz. So this is going to actually redirect to the quiz template, but using the app.root/quiz that we are about to make. So here we will create our app.root/quiz, and we'll create a method, or we need to pass in methods, and we'll use get and post because we are going to be posting to it as well. And we'll say def quiz_view, and then here we will say if request.method is double equal to post, and then we'll say selected option is equal to request.form.get, and then option, so that will be an input field in the HTML that has a name of option. Current question index is equal to session.get, and then current question. So we'll say if selected option is not none, so if there is a selected option, then we'll say correct option is equal to quiz.questions, and then we'll pass in the current question index, and then we will use the correct option attribute. So this is going to look into this list, find the second question, and then get this attribute. And we'll say if, and then we'll pass this to an int. So we'll say selected option is equal to correct option. Session score, we will increment by 1. So now outside of these, we'll say session current question, and we'll make that increment by 1 as well, because if they've got it wrong, then it still needs to move on to the next question. And then we'll say if session current question is greater than or equal to the length of the quiz questions, so the length of the list of this. So technically in ours it should only be 3. And then we will return redirect URL for, and this will be to a results page. And then here we will just say current question index is equal to session.get, and then pass in current question. And we'll say question is equal to quiz.questions at the current question index. And then we're just going to return render template for quiz.html. We'll pass in the question, and then question index, which will be equal to current question index plus 1, because obviously indexing starts at 0. And then total questions is equal to the length of quiz.questions. And now we can move on to the results page. So we'll create another route. So app.root /results, and then def results. And then here we just want to essentially get the score of whatever they scored. So we'll say score is equal to session.get, and we'll pass in the score. So we are retrieving this variable, and then if they put it right, it should be more than 0. So total questions is equal to the length of quiz.questions, and then return, we'll just create a heading 1 that says your score, and then pass in score, and we'll also pass in total questions. So that will say 1 out of 3 basically. So now we have a working app. Now we have our logic sorted, as long as there's no mistakes. We head over to our quiz.html, and we'll create a HTML5 boilerplate. And then in here, we will just create or change the title to say quiz application. And we're going to link to Bootstrap. So this will be https stackpath.bootstrapcdn.com/bootstrap 4.5.2 CSS, and we'll get the minified version. And then inside of this body tag, we will create a div, and we'll say div container with a margin top of 5. We'll say heading 1 with margin bottom of 4, and this will just say quiz. And then we'll create a form with a method of post. And inside the form, we'll create a heading 3 that is the questions text. So that will be this attribute. Then we'll create a form group, which will hold the options. So we'll say we'll say for option in question.options, So we're going to be looping through all of these options, which will be Paris, London, Berlin, Madrid. And then we'll create an end for. And inside of this, we will create an input that is a radio button. The name will be option, so this will be what's passed in here. We will give it a class of form check input. And actually inside of this, we will create a div for form check. And we'll move this into the div. We can actually pass in here option, and then we'll say loop.index and then 0. And then we'll give it a value as well. And we'll do the same again, just so the ID and the value are the same. So option loop.index 0. There are 2 sets of curly brackets which are not needed. And then we will say required. And then here we will say label, and we'll pass in here for option loop.index 0. So that will match up with these here. And then we will give it a class of form check label, and inside the label we will just pass in the option. So now that's done, we can now come down to underneath this div. So still inside of the actual form itself, and we can say button with a type of submit. We'll say next, and we'll give it a class of btn primary. So this is just very simple bootstrap styling. And outside the form, we will give it a p tag, which has a class of margin top 3. We'll say question, and then here we'll say question index, and then of total questions. So now if I come back to terminal and then run it again, we have the app working still. So now if I refresh, could not build URL for endpoint quiz. URL for quiz, is that because it needs to be quiz view potentially? Perfect. So that needs to match this. And obviously, I mean, we could change that to quiz view as well. But for now, that matching this works. Obviously, we couldn't call it quiz because we have a variable up here called quiz. So it would be a conflict. So we've created that as quiz view. So this needs to route to that. So now if we say, what is the capital of France? Paris. Invalid literal for int. Base option 0. The value is meant to be loop.index. That's my bad. So in here, we don't actually need option. So it is just loop.index 0. And then come over to here and refresh. Okay, so I think it was still cached from the option there because I have removed it and then tried it again, and then it came up with an error for this session. It was actually spelled like that. So if we add an S in there and then try it again, it actually works. So now we've moved on to question 2. Which planet is known as the red planet? For this one we'll say Saturn. And then question 3, which is the largest ocean, we'll say the Pacific. So if I press next, we should now head over to the results page and hopefully see how many I got right. Perfect. So we just have a very simple basic, your score is 2 out of 3. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use object-oriented programming and Flask logic to create a very simple quiz app. To take this further, you could create a route which will add the questions and answers in yourself. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos coming. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon.